Autoencoders, as mentioned a couple of weeks ago, are models where the inputs are also used as output labels in determining the behavior of the model. So the model is required to produce the same thing that is fed into it. Obviously, there is a trivial solution to this problem, which is not very interesting, but it may not even be completely obvious that non-trivial solutions to this problem are necessarily very interesting or useful either. However, to reconstruct an input when you're not allowed to just copy it, you'll need to find some kind of interesting representation that captures all of the useful and important features of the input in some other form. And as discussed before in the context of word embeddings and other things, it may well be that that kind of representation is itself interesting. So a common pattern for models that take in data and produce other data, particularly common in NLP and in sequence modeling, but not exclusively, is the encoder-decoder pattern. In this, we can sort of consider the model as having two separate components. The encoder translates the input into some internal representation, and the decoder then translates that internal representation to the desired output. We discussed this kind of structure in the context of machine translation. So many languages have extremely different ways of representing the content of a sentence, and it's not usually practical to just translate as you go along, one token at a time, but instead you need to capture the complete essence of a sentence in one language in order to be able to translate it into the structures and patterns of a completely different language. This is not just a pattern in machine learning, it is also common in other fields. For example, in computer language compilers, it's very common to have a decoupling of the initial parsing of the input language from the generation of the machine code for a different platform via one or more stages of internal intermediate representation. It should be noted that this idea of distilling the exact essence of what is said in a particular language into some abstract form that captures all of its qualities, independent of the structure and details of the source language, is kind of reductive and sits somewhat uneasily with many of the ways in which people actually use language. Form and content in many kinds of spoken and written language are not uniquely separable from one another. Things like jokes and songs and poetry are all actually really hard to translate because they depend very much on the formal properties of the language. They depend on allusions and assonances, the way words appear on the page or sound like next to one another. They depend on double meanings and misdirection and rhythm and puns. The French author Georges Perec wrote a novel called La Disparition, in which the letter E was omitted entirely, which is kind of a formal trick, but also is a relevant feature in the content of the novel. Imagine the difficulties in translation posed for the person Gilbert Adair, who had to translate that into English whilst retaining this lipogrammic quality. Whole books have been written about the complexities of translating poetry and other formal language and how that relates to machine translation. Douglas Hofstadter's Le Tombeau de Marot is a very interesting case in point. Getting back to autoencoders, autoencoders are typically thought of and structured in exactly this encoder-decoder pair arrangement. The encoder half produces some internal representation of the input, and the decoder has to reconstruct the original input from this internal representation or code. To avoid the unwanted, trivial solution of just copying the inputs straight to the outputs, the code is usually restricted to be significantly smaller than the input. In effect, the encoder is required to perform some form of dimensionality reduction, distilling all of the salient features of the input in some fashion into some much smaller representation from which it can still be reconstructed. An interesting question arises then, which is, where is the information from the input actually present throughout the autoencoder? Does it all latently exist in the internal coded representation, or is it in some way distributed throughout the network? In the context of cryptography, it is common to distinguish between ciphers and codes. Ciphers are purely formal. They operate mechanically on the form of a message to obscure it and make the information within it invisible, but the information is still there if you know the key. Codes, on the other hand, assign meaning to some arbitrary signifiers. In order to decode them, you need a lookup table of what those signifiers actually represent, known as a code book. These two poles of representation are a useful way of thinking about how an autoencoder might work. But it's not a strict dichotomy. There can be a mixture of the two. The decoder, part of the autoencoder, will capture procedural knowledge about how to translate the encoded form into the output image. This may involve a mixture of arbitrary lookups and pulling out information that is present directly in the code. Let us imagine that the training set consists of just two images, but they're complex images, they have lots of detail in them. And the bottlenecked code in our autoencoder is just a single bit, so it can only encode two different states. There is no more information about the images other than it is one or the other. In this kind of situation, the decoder must essentially memorize both of the images and then just look them up according to what the code bit says. So that's fine if you have only two images, but let's imagine that the training set is 1,000,000 images, but you've still only got one bit. Well, in that case, first of all, the decoder is likely to do extremely badly. But probably the best that it can hope to do is kind of perform an implicit clustering of the images and come out with the two most modal sort of means of the images, and then mapping the bit values to one or other of those. It's still memorizing, but it's memorizing a kind of aggregated form across the population of images. If the code is much bigger than a single bit, although still much smaller than the individual images, it may be possible for the code to capture all of the important degrees of freedom in the images, which, remember, we tend to think of as occupying a low-dimensional manifold within the image space. And then the decoder would be able to capture procedural knowledge about mapping those low-dimensional degrees of freedom back into the output space. But alternatively, with that bigger code, it could just have more distinct tokens to look up in its internal lookup table, having memorized all of the 1,000,000 images. One of the key differences between these two extremes of ways in which the images could be encoded and reconstructed lies in the smoothness of the space known as the latent space in which the code or embedding resides. If in encoding all of the inputs are mapped to discrete and completely unrelated points within the latent space, then the output becomes basically a lookup table. Conversely, if the spatial relationships within the latent space between different points encode some semantically important information, then it's likely that there's a more fluid way of reconstructing the information that is embodied in those relationships. This may still depend on an awful lot of data-specific procedural knowledge in the decoder, but more of the information actually has been captured in the latent space in some way. In the latter case, the decoder might be able to function on other vectors, other arbitrary points in the latent space that have never been seen. The decoder may embody some smooth or smoothish inverse projection from the latent space to the true data distribution. Of course, this isn't necessarily always exactly the case. Think back to the discussion of word embeddings. In that case, the words are projected into a continuous space where the spatial relationships have some kind of semantic and syntactic meaning. But there isn't a universal inverse function to that. We can still only map points to real, discrete words. Given this basic encoder-decoder structure that we've chosen for our autoencoders, where the data distribution is mapped to an internal encoding and then the internal encoding is mapped back to the data distribution, it's not strictly required that the input distribution and the output distribution be exactly the same. We might want, for example, for the decoder to produce something which is like the original input but changed in some way. A common example is that you might perturb the input by adding noise to it and then attempt to reconstruct in the decoder the unperturbed original. This is the idea of what are known as denoising autoencoders. And the essential question there is, can we learn through the process of passing through some latent space representation to separate the signal from the noise in the input? It turns out that yes, we can. Once again, we can imagine two extremes of strategies in which a denoising autoencoder might work. One way would be for the encoder to project all of the different perturbations of an image to the same point in the latent space. Conversely, we could imagine that the decoder maps all of the fuzzily varied points that are generated by the encoder to the same output image. In this case, it's the decoder that's doing the denoising. If we're training a denoising autoencoder from end to end, it's likely that the true division of labor will be somewhere in between. There'll be some denoising in the projection to the latent space and also some in the reconstruction of the data. But we might have a good reason for wanting to encourage something a bit closer to the latter, because we don't want to be having discrete points in the latent space for each of the clouds of perturbed images. We would rather have a smoother latent space where each of those clouds smooths out a bit and extends into its neighbours. In this kind of space, we might hope that similar inputs are projected to similar positions in the latent space, and similar positions in the latent space are projected to similar outputs. This idea of fuzzing out the input vectors into the fuzzy positions in the latent space calls back to our discussion of generative modelling. What we're attempting to do there is capture the distribution of the data. If we think about the data as a random variable, we can reconceptualize this in probabilistic terms. This leads us to an alternative kind of autoencoder known as a variational autoencoder. In this case, we are quite explicitly trying to project from the distribution of the data to a latent distribution, usually with some prescribed form, such that the variations in the data are captured by the variations in the distribution in the latent space. The optimization problem then that's required for a variational autoencoder is a bit different from that for an ordinary autoencoder. In this case, the encoder part is attempting to map from the input data distribution to a specified form of internal distribution that has the same properties as closely as possible as the specified distribution. So it looks multivariate Gaussian, for example. The decoder, meanwhile, attempts to map a latent vector sampled from that distribution to something in the same region of the original data distribution that would have given rise to something like that latent vector. So here there is a stochastic decoupling between the two parts of the system. The encoder doesn't talk directly to the decoder. It defines a space that the decoder can sample from. The two parts of the system have different loss functions. The loss function for the decoder is pretty similar to the loss function that you would have for a normal autoencoder. It will be looking at the reconstruction loss. So the output produced by the decoder, how similar is it to the expected output? The loss function for the encoder, however, is completely different. The requirement there is that the projections of the data into the latent space, as closely as possible, resemble the prescribed distribution. So if, for example, that distribution is Gaussian with mean 0 and variance 1 on all of the dimensions, which is quite a common variational autoencoder prescription, then the loss will be assessed on how much the distribution of latent vectors from all of the input data corresponds to that distribution. This requires a kind of similarity metric of distributions, and that similarity metric in this case will be the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which we mentioned a couple of weeks ago in the context of T-SNE. So this is similar to the cross entropy, but with an additional kind of corrective term that looks like this. The overall loss function for the variational autoencoder then takes this form here. You've got a loss for the reconstruction on the decoder and a loss for the distribution produced on the encoder. As usual in these situations, there's some kind of hyperparameter which specifies the balance of power between those two losses, here represented by the C on the reconstruction loss. A useful way of thinking about the divergence loss on the encoder is as a regularizer that imposes a kind of smoothness on the latent space. Obviously, our goal is going to be to fit the variational autoencoder, to optimize it by descending the gradients of this variational autoencoder loss. However, there's a bit of a problem here, which is that there isn't a neat flow of gradients through this formulation. The two halves of the model are decoupled through this random sampling within the latent space that produces the output for the decoder. We can't backpropagate through randomness. Instead, what we do is known as the reparameterization trick, and that is to pull out the randomness as a separate noise term, which is injected into the model during training, to treat the rest of the model as purely deterministic, including the relationship between the projection from the encoder to the decoder. The encoder is still projecting to a distribution within the latent space for each particular sample, in here represented by a mean and a variance within all of the dimensions of the latent space for that particular sample. The additional noise input, epsilon, is just randomly sampled from the target distribution, which in this case would be a zero mean unit variance multivariate Gaussian. The decoder then generates its output from the perturbed form of the outputs of the encoder. So the encoded mean vector plus the sampled noise multiplied by the encoded variance vector. Unlike the original formulation, all of this is deterministic with the exception of the noise term epsilon, and we can backpropagate to the parts that we care about perfectly naturally. Effectively, the training process just adds noise to the latent vectors that it uses, but the amount of noise is one of the things that the encoder is learning. The latent space learned this way by the variational autoencoder is explicitly forced to be a smooth, continuous distribution. We can draw arbitrary vectors from this distribution, and there should be some corresponding output to be generated by the decoder. These latent vectors don't have to be random. For example, we can interpolate along a path in the latent space to produce the data outputs that would correspond to vectors all the way along that path. Here's an example of such an interpolation in the latent space of a variational autoencoder that was trained on MNIST digits. And here are some interpolation examples from an autoencoder trained on faces. So we've sort of assumed here that all of the features in the data distribution, all of the different dimensions of variability are all kind of equivalent, that the whole thing is unimodal and can be expressed in a single Gaussian distribution without any kind of separation of the different dimensions of variability. In practice, this might well not be the case. The data might naturally kind of separate into different clusters or regions in a similar way to with a Gaussian mixture model. If we force all of those different kinds of inputs into a homogeneous distribution in the latent space, then all of the different interesting dimensions of variability can become entangled, so that variations associated with one of the innate classes get mixed up with the variations that are associated with others. We saw that in the previous MNIST example, and here is another example also using MNIST, where the variations across the latent space kind of interpolate through the different classes of digit, producing various kind of fuzzy mix-ups in the middle. But if we know about important class differences in the input, we can inject that as an additional piece of information during the training and allow the network to condition its learned dimensions on that additional information. This can help separate out the different distributions for the different classes so that we can then reconstruct the right things later. We can similarly pass these kinds of class labels in when we're using the model to generate data from arbitrary new latent vectors, forcing the model to produce outputs of the desired class. In these examples, the latent vector has been interpolated along a dimension which seems to correspond to the angle of writing of the image, but the separate examples have been conditioned on the desired digit, and so the digits are not themselves tangled up. These kind of generative models, like variational autoencoders and conditional variational autoencoders, that have a smooth interpolatable latent space, can be used for generating data which sometimes may look pretty convincing, even though it's essentially completely synthetic. In the next video, we'll see another method that does this even better.